So this is our afternoon session, which will be focusing on marine fisheries. And as I mentioned earlier, we have two speakers here. We have Steve Gaines and Larry Crowder. And then after their respective talks, we'll have another moderated discussion like we did this morning. I'd like to introduce Steve Gaines, and I'm not talking about the guitarist and songwriter for Lynyrd Skynyrd. I'm talking about the current dean of the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I first met Steve in 1990 while I was still at Brown University. And as I began to learn more and more about his work, it became clear to me that Steve was really focused on big and important questions, but he's still faithful to the importance of the little things. And Steve and I know some people that sometimes ignore the little things. He's done a lot of work on marine ecology and conservation, sustainable fisheries, the design of marine reserves, and the impact of climate change on marine ecosystems. He's published over 120 papers, many of which are considered classics in marine ecology. Steve's had a really strong influence on my career in terms of how I think about things. Today, Steve will be talking about new insights into the status of global fisheries. Please join me in welcoming Steve.
Thanks, Jeff. And how do you know that the two Steve Gaines are not the same person?
Just the pictures.
Well, you know, that supposed plane crash just happened to be the year I started grad school, so you never know. Okay, so we're going to do things a little bit differently in the afternoon because we're going to take a deep dive into one of these challenges as opposed to the really excellent overviews of the broad array of issues that are facing oceans that you heard this morning. And that allows us to do, I think, a few important things. One of them in particular that I think will be a nice contrast is really to start focusing on solutions and successes. And I think Larry and I are both going to try and emphasize that in addition to the fact that the challenges are large and difficult. So I don't have to spend a lot of time convincing you that oceans are valuable. Ove did a great job in doing that. But I do want to emphasize one thing, and that is that there's this long list of things that people value about oceans, but not all people value the same things. And as a consequence, a lot of the problems we're talking about are being driven by the fact that there are potential and perceived conflicts between obtaining these different values at the same time. And so when we think about fisheries, this becomes a really important issue in terms of thinking about, are there ways to actually achieve multiple objectives when there are a diverse array of things that are valued, or are there inherent trade-offs between different uses that society has to make choices on? And so I'll try and come back to that as I talk through this. So Sylvia talked a lot yesterday about the rapid change that's been happening in oceans, and I think the easiest way to see this in terms of setting the stage for fisheries is just look at the fraction of the ocean where we had catches that were at or exceeding the maximum productivity for those particular parts of the ocean. And here's what it was in 1965 when I was 10 years old. And this is what it looked like 30 years later. So we've had this dramatic transformation in our lifespan in the sense of the amount of the ocean that's actually been intensively fished. And as a consequence, all the options of moving someplace else to fix problems in other places are off the table because there's no place left to go in the ocean. And so we really need to be thinking about it from the standpoint of fish in terms of how good of a job we are doing in the entire ocean where we are fishing. And this issue becomes even more important, and this was mentioned a little bit this morning, when we start thinking about the nature of demand for fish as a source of food. This is the current consumption on our planet of different sources of animal protein. And about 20% of this comes from the sea. The top two blue bars are wild-caught fish and aquaculture. The rest are all land sources. This demand is projected to grow in a really dramatic way in coming decades, and for two reasons. One is there are going to be a lot more people. We all know about that. But the other is equally large of an effect, and this is the consequence of increasing in wealth. And And we see this when we compare across countries. The fraction of the diet that comes from animal protein goes up dramatically as wealth increases. And we see this also as wealth increases within countries. So China, for example, in the last couple of decades with a dramatic increase in wealth, has followed this curve within the country quite closely, with a really dramatic increase in the fraction of protein that individuals consume that is coming from animals. And so if we put these two things together in terms of economic projections and the projections in terms of the number of people, this is what we project the global demand is going to be for animal protein in 2050, just less than 40 years from now. An 80% increase over what we consume today. It's a whopping increase. And if we don't really think about the impacts of what that's going to do, where it's going to come from, how it's going to affect livelihoods, food security issues, and things along these lines, we're going to be really missing a big part of the fisheries question. Okay, so why are we even having to talk about what's the status of the world's fisheries? Why is it so hard to figure out how many fish there are? I mean, if we think about this from the standpoint of most of the kinds of comparable issues on land, it's pretty easy to see when we have grossly over-harvested or altered ecosystems in a way that really channel things. But just to give you a real sense of why it's hard for fish, I can use 3 just simple picture slides. One is that this is not what we see when we see the ocean. This is what we see. So we have no idea of using, in terms of everyday experience bumping into things. We've heard about that a little bit in terms of how we raise that visibility. The second is that we have a lot of data, but it almost all comes in this form, which is how many fish we've caught. And if we're trying to think about the status of fisheries and where they can go and how healthy they are and how many should we be catching next year, we don't need to know how many we caught. We need to know how many are left. And so this is the real challenge, is that we get a lot of insight on what we take out, but we have to make insightful conclusions and management decisions. We have to know how many are still left. And that's a hard thing. So fisheries biologists have developed some very elaborate and wonderful ways of assessing the stock size, how many fish are left in the sea for different kinds of things. And it involves a variety of different things. You need to have models of the fish in terms of how their populations work. You need to have models of the fishermen in terms of how they respond to different kinds of rules. And you couple this with a whole variety of different kinds of data that some of it comes from the fishery, some of it comes from agencies that are collecting the data independently. And the net result of this is they are very elaborate, often wonderful models in terms of population models of how fish stocks work. But they're ad hoc in the sense that every fishery is different, and they're really expensive. On average, they cost about $500,000 to do a single assessment for a single species. So you can see very quickly that this is not going to be an approach that works for most of the world's fisheries, given that many of the world's fisheries aren't even worth this much. So there's no way you can afford to be spending this kind of money to assess how many fish are out there in the ocean. But what do we know from these formal stock assessments? We actually have about 300 species now around the world where we have these kinds of assessments. And this is what we've learned. So this is one way of looking at the results, which is just a map of the current status, where the color code here is a measure of the status of the stock, how much fish biomass is still left out there in the water, relative to what a target would be if we were trying to achieve some level of maximum production. And if you ignore the North Atlantic, the world looks actually pretty good. And this is a very different message than those of you that were at Sylvia's talk last night or some of the examples we heard this morning. That if we actually look at the fisheries that have stock assessments around the world, there is a lot of good news. There actually are a lot of fisheries that are doing reasonably well. Okay? So this is one way of looking at it, but I need to teach you how to read a different kind of map to be able to dig into this a little bit more. And this is another kind of map that's a unique map that allows you to know not only where you are, where the fishery is, but also where it's heading. Okay, and so there are kind of 4 quadrants here, and the x-axis on the bottom is a measure of the number or the biomass of fish relative to what our target would be for a fish stock that would be at a maximum sustainable level of production. Okay? And so that line on the bottom, right here, this area here, is right where you would want to be in terms of having your fish stock at a maximum level of production. Okay? So this axis is essentially measuring where the stock is. Anything to the left of that vertical line means that we have fewer fish than you'd want in terms of having maximum production. Anything to the right means we have more fish than you'd want in terms of getting maximum production. And that may seem counterintuitive for you, those of you that are not thinking about fisheries, but I'll come back to that in a second about what that means. So this is where we are. The other axis tells us, though, where we're heading. And this is a measure of how hard we are fishing these stocks. And in the same way that we can have a reference point about how much biomass, we can also have a reference point on the level of mortality that we are imparting on these fish stocks relative to the level that would give us a stock size in the future that's right where we would get this maximum level of production. So this axis shows that. This value is you're right on target. Values up here means you're fishing too hard. You are actually killing too many fish to be able to actually have that stock eventually equilibrate to a level that's where you want it to be for maximum production. And down here are places where you are fishing at a lower level, either because you're letting the stock recover or for other kinds of reasons. So this axis tells us where the stock is heading. That if, in fact, we're up in this region, biomass is going to be going down. If, in fact, we're down in this region, you can actually have biomasses going up. So the combination of knowing where you are in this place tells you where we are and where we're going in the future. Okay? So if, in fact, your entire goal was to maximize production from the ocean for a particular stock, that's where you want to be, at a level of biomass and fishing mortality that actually gives you the maximum level of production. Now, if you have other goals, so for example, if you're trying to maximize profits, or if you're trying to take advantage, be precautionary because of the nature of uncertainty we have about future climates or other kinds of aspects of the real world, you actually may want to be here. This is the place where you actually get maximum profitability, because even though you're catching a smaller number of fish, they cost less to catch because they're more abundant. So we want to evaluate where the world's fisheries are relative to those kinds of points, that you either want to be near the center or, if anything, a little bit in that lower right-hand quadrant. So if we go back to that set of 300 fisheries where we have really good assessments, here's where they are in this map. And the color, every one of the black dots is a different fishery, so there's a lot of variability here. And the color code is kind of a heat map where the highest concentration of these is down in that really deep red center in the bottom left. And so what you can see from this is that on average, just as that other map showed you, fish stocks that we know a lot about are a little bit less abundant than where you would like them to be, but the mortality rate, the average mortality that we're imparting on these stocks because of fisheries, is also on average a little bit lower. And so the reaction on the part of the management agencies to the fact that these stocks are lower in abundance than what the target would be has been appropriate on average. That we are seeing lower mortality rates on average for this fishery group as a whole. Okay? Now that's looking at average. There's a lot to be learned by digging into this a little bit more and looking at where the successes have been, where the failures still are in this context, and what this means about broader things. So you hear a lot about tunas, for example. If we look at a variety of the world's tuna fisheries, on average, they're actually not in that bad a shape, despite the fact this is a species we hear a lot of concerns about their stock. And this is largely driven by the fact that bluefins are way up here, where the stock size is dramatically below where you'd want it to be as a target rate, and the fishing mortality rate continues to be at a level which is dramatically higher, many multiples higher than what you'd want for a sustainable stock. But The other major tunas that we're looking at here, particularly the Pacific tunas, are actually not in that bad of shape in the sense that they're reasonably close to where we would want them to be in terms of biomass for maximum level production. We can look at this by countries. The gold star by country probably goes to New Zealand in the sense that their stocks are on average centered right in the sweet spot for where you'd want for maximum economic yield, and a biomass that's a little bit above what you'd want for maximum sustainable yield. US stocks are about on the right biomass, and the fishing mortality rates on average are a little below the fishing mortality rate for sustainability. And the EU, sorry, Steve. The EU is not the model you want to follow for this. There are also all kinds of other things that come out of digging into this. One is the consequence of how many countries you actually have to get to cooperate on managing a fishery. That if we look at the average status of fisheries that occur entirely within a single country, on average, they're not doing very poorly, all right? You go to 2 or 3, they're at half the stock size. You go to greater than 10, they're not only at half the stock size, but you still have a mortality rate that's going high. So, worse and worse shape on average by the more countries that have to get involved in making decisions about how you fish the stock. Okay, so that's one deep dive into this. But as I noted, this is only a view that is given us by these 300 fisheries where we have these really elaborate stock assessments. And to put that into context, depends how you count fisheries, there are somewhere between 15 and 20,000 fisheries on the planet. And this is the view you get from 300. The 300 that we know a lot about, and the reason why we know a lot about them is they tend to be valuable, large, and in countries that have really well-established management agencies. So what about the other 15, 16, 17,000? What's their current status? And this is a complicated problem. I mean, you have seen some of these slides up here today about indirect measures that allow us to ask what's the status of the world's fisheries in the context of these fisheries that we don't know as much about. The unfortunate thing is that every one of these measures, and there have been some very high-profile papers here, is a very indirect measure of how many fish are actually still in the sea. And the question, and there's been a lot of pushback on the part of fisheries biologists about the accuracy that these kinds of indirect measures, what they really tell us about the stocks that are left in the ocean. And so we took this on as a challenge a couple of years ago to think about, can we actually enhance the fraction of the world's fisheries that we have a more quantitative assessment of actual stock size? And to do this, we had to ask the question in a different way. The typical approach that we as scientists like to do is to think about this problem and try to figure out what's the best way to answer the question. So this is what has happened in the development of stock assessments is they're very complicated. We've developed these really elaborate models, and they're wonderful models for actually assessing stock status, but they don't work for most things because they're too expensive. So we kind of flipped it on its head and said, what if we take the kinds of information that we readily have, and that's what these boxes are. These are the kinds of information that we have for a lot of fisheries around the world, and they have to do with mainly some aspects of catch, some basic biology that scientists have figured out over the years, and some characteristics of the general fishery, and ask, how well can we predict the status of the stock using nothing more than the data that are readily available? So constraining what we do to only the data that are readily available. And that was one of the key things. The other one that turned out to be the really key in terms of why this ultimately worked, it has to do with what we tried to predict. And this comes down to, many people have talked about the stocks of fish in the ocean using the metaphor of a bank, that they're banks that are producing interest, which is offspring that then grow into new fish, and that we can, as long as we harvest at a rate that is comparable to what this interest rate is, then that we can sustainably be maintaining that population size and sustainably be drawing those kinds of stocks out of it. The problem is that with that metaphor is that this is a really weird bank. It's a weird bank because if you look at the nature of the way the interest rate works, is if you put in more fish, as you increase the number of fish, just like a normal bank account would be, your interest, the total interest you accumulate out of this goes up and up and up to some point where then it starts to go down. And it starts to go down because of the fact that these stocks are actually most productive at intermediate densities. And you can see this, anybody that's planted a garden that knows that as you increase the number of carrots you put in your garden, you get more and more carrots up to a point where they get so crowded they start competing with each other, and you can eventually get no carrots out of it if you plant too many. So the key point of this is that the interest rate that the total stock produces peaks at some level, at some intermediate level of biomass. And the trick that we were able to use in this particular case is it turned out to be relatively easy to predict how close you are to the peak, even though we're not really predicting how many fish there are or what that peak value is. So I can predict that I'm very close to this maximum level of productivity, even though I don't know how many fish there are, and I don't know what that maximum level of biomass, what the optimal level of biomass actually is. So I'm just predicting how close I am to this ratio, and the reason why it's a good predictor is because it influences how much new production happens in a way that's very predictable from the standpoint of thinking about how many fish you're going to be able to catch in future years. Okay, now I know you're all really interested in this part, which here's the model that comes out of this. I'm going to expect you to memorize this, and we'll come back to that in the questions. One of the things, so what we were able to do with this approach, and there's a lot more details about the actual approach, but we're able to expand the number of stocks that we think we can get a reasonable stock assessment estimate on to by several thousand species. So pretty dramatically increasing the total number of stocks on the planet that we have good assessments for. And here's their kind of distribution. Gives us a much better global look at how things are changing. There still are thousands which we can't use this approach for, and we can come back to that. And so here are the results. On average, if we look at over the last 30-year period, the black line here is what was happening with the average, the median fishery, over this period of time for the ones that have really good stock assessments. And you can see that they decline down to a value just below your target of 1, and then it's pretty much leveled off, which reflects the fact that on average we've had many good management decisions by a number of countries, EU excluded, in terms of how this is played out over time within that group. And so it's leveled off, and it's actually sitting at a value of about 0.9. If we look at the group that was previously unassessed, it shows a very different pattern. One, on average, it's in substantially worse shape. And the second part of this is there's no hint that, despite the fact that these stocks are in bad shape, that there's any evidence of them actually starting to level off. So it's been a continuous decline over the 30-year period, and the average stock point is at about 0.6. So about 60% of the biomass where you'd want these to be, roughly on average, to be getting maximal level of production. The status of stocks varies dramatically between different kinds of species. Some things are very close to the target level of about 1. Other ones like sharks and cartilaginous fishes, sturgeons, and this broad category called miscellaneous coastal fishes, which will become important in a minute, which all of those are well below a half of where you'd want to be for maximum level of production. The other thing that really emerged out of this is that even if we look at the group that has no prior formal assessment, there was a big effect of the size of the fishery, that large-scale fisheries on average are in substantially better shape than small-scale fisheries are, even though both are showing the same trend. So there's a gap between their performance on average, but their trend is basically the same. Okay, so let's come back to this map. Here's the map again we had that was for the fisheries that were really well studied. Here's the corresponding map that emerges when we look at these now several thousand fisheries being added. So not surprisingly, what you're seeing is that on average, most of the planet looks in much worse shape. And don't get too excited about Australia down there, because the dashed lines mean that that particular region, even with this new approach that we have, still doesn't get us up to a third of the total catch that's happening there in terms of so it's not that Australia's the problem in that case, it's more Indonesia and other countries in that region that, for reporting reasons, we can't get at this. But the striking thing you can see here is that countries that do really well for the fisheries that are well assessed can do dramatically worse when we don't have assessments. So US West Coast, perfect example of this. Here's the other map. So the red dots here are the positions, the centroid for some of the countries for the previously assessed ones that I already showed you. The blue dots are all the countries now that we can look at, get an average for that are unassessed. And the width, the size of the dot has to do with the total landings for that particular fishery. But what you can see very clearly is that they, on average, move to substantially lower amount of fish. They move to the left, and they move up into that left level, which means that the current fishing intensity is dramatically higher than what you would want for these to be in any way recovering from the fact that we've already dropped them down to half the target level where you'd want them to be. Now, the cool thing we can do on this is we can actually look at this through time. So I'm going to show you 20 of these countries so you can see what's happened in terms of the behavior of these fisheries over about a 30 or more like a 50-year time frame in this case. This is not what you want to see happening. You can see that biomass goes down to about half of where your target level happens, and then what happens is that fishing mortality rate starts going up like crazy. And exactly the kind of response you'd expect if, in fact, individuals in the fisheries are trying to maintain a similar catch level, and that as the abundances go down, they work harder, the overall mortality rate actually goes up, and it has to go up for them to be catching a comparable number of fish because there are fewer fish left in the ocean. So we started down here in the 1950s. Today, this is the distribution of those 20 countries. The other thing that when we first saw these results, we thought, oh, this is really an issue of small-scale developing world fisheries versus the more developed world fisheries where you have stronger institutions and things along those lines. And because I've already shown you that small-scale fisheries on average are doing worse. So then what we did was we said, well, let's divide this out. So this is only the fisheries that were previously unassessed. We're going to look at developed nations, undeveloped nations, and we're not going to penalize the developed nations by the EU. So we're pulling that out. You see how this plays out. And here they go. Starting in about the same place, of course. And exactly opposite of the way we originally thought these results might imply about it, the developed nation pattern for small-scale unassessed fisheries are worse than developing nations. And in fact, if anything, what happens in this case is the developing nations are about a 20-year lag of going along the exact same path. Okay? And Europe is, about the same as the rest of the developed nations, so it doesn't stand out. We can also do this now by the different species, and the same kind of insight I showed you in terms of the averages. The real thing that stands out is the horrible condition of sharks and cartilaginous fishes, which end up way up there in the upper left corner. But the flip side, and this is a point I want to make, is even in these unassessed fisheries, there are certain groups of species that are not doing that badly. I mean, so this isn't a situation where everything is in terrible shape. By actually having detailed information about the status of different stocks in different locations, we can identify what's working and what's not, what kinds of things seem to be robust to the level of management that's happening there, and which things are not. Right, so there's a lot more we could talk about that you can glean by actually having some quantitative information about fisheries, but I want to come back now to the implications and solutions that this implies. So I started with this notion of this food problem. And once we get a better sense of where what the global pattern, the geographical pattern of stock status is, it allows us to now start putting this back in the context of where this growing demand is going to occur. And the map on the bottom is a map of countries where the color, the intensity of the blue tells you the fraction of the diet that on average comes from seafood. And what you can see is that it's very much concentrated in the developing world tropics, which on average, from the standpoint of the stocks that we looked at in the previous slides, is a region that is focused on these small-scale coastal fisheries, which are in pretty bad shape relative to stocks as a whole, and if anything have shown a continuous decline over the last 30 years. So despite the fact that this is the area where seafood plays the biggest role in terms of animal consumption, these are the areas where much of the growth in consumption we're anticipating is going to happen in the next 40 years. These are places where we really need to be focusing our attention in terms of thinking about meeting these kinds of food security demands. The other side of this problem really comes down to, I'm emphasizing this as slightly a fish problem. And we've been doing some detailed analysis about thinking about the broad array of ways you can actually meet this food demand. And there have been a couple of analyses that have looked at this, about how you can meet it from the standpoint of meat on land. They are awful choices in terms of environmental impacts that come out of this. And I'm going to show you in a second what those look like. But so one of the issues in terms of how these two things intersect comes down to cost, and there's a variety of ways of measuring cost. There's the cost per unit of protein, and this is a plot. It's looking broadly across different sources of animal protein, and on average, wild-caught fish tend to be the cheapest if we look at this globally in terms of the amount of fish that you get per unit of money. All right, and second in line is aquaculture. So from that standpoint, they're low cost in terms of meeting these kinds of growth and global demands. There's a whole variety of other ways you can measure cost, and we've heard a lot today about the impact of climate change on fisheries. I want to flip this on its head and talk about the impact of fisheries on climate change, because we've had some discussion about various kinds of ways that our behavior influences greenhouse gas emissions. Well, one of the biggest is food. And it's a very large fraction of the total global production of CO2 because of the consequences of land conversion, transportation, and things that go along with this. And just to show you this, so if we look at this from the standpoint of the greenhouse gas emissions that come from a given unit of consumption of animal protein for the four largest sources of animal protein that come from land. Each of these, the bar shows you the average across studies for a whole variety of ways of producing beef and poultry and so on and so forth. The green bar in these cases, the second color, shows you the best case scenario. So if we look across the array of ways that beef is produced, the best standard today, the lowest level you can get, is this value right here. So on average, beef's producing this much CO2 per unit of protein. The best case scenario using existing best standards is down here. And you can see that in each one of the bars. So this is from land. Here's what happens if we put oceans on this table. And I've got two different sides of the ocean problem. On the right is wild-caught fisheries caught by different methods. And this turns out to be the biggest driver of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with fisheries, is how you catch the fish. Okay? And what you can see is that on average, it's substantially lower. And in some cases, in best cases, in some of these cases, they're dramatically lower than even the best case scenario of any form of animal meat production on land. On the left hand is the same sorts of data for aquaculture. Again, there's a variety of ways of producing it: fed versus unfed, fish versus invertebrates, land-based ponds versus ocean. You get a very similar conclusion that on average it's substantially lower greenhouse gas impacts than any form of production on land. And for best case scenarios, it can be dramatically lower than any way we can produce animal protein on land. Now, this is just one way of measuring environmental impacts. We've got about 6 of these we're looking at: nutrient loading, biodiversity impacts. But the general conclusion is very similar, that on average, these two classes of production from the ocean do substantially better in terms of their cost, both economic costs as well as environmental costs, in terms of meeting this projected growth in demand. This is especially true when we think about wild-caught fisheries, where we've got the stocks that are overfished. So imagine for the small-scale fisheries that I talked about, where the value is at about a half of where the target would be. That means that if we fix this problem, rather than creating environmental problems to produce more food, we actually would double the number of fish in the sea, if we got that up to a level of our target of 1. And simultaneously would be increasing production by, depending upon the species, something on the order of 50%. So this is one of these cases where meeting this challenge and understanding the nature of the way these things interact gives you a potential for a real win-win in this situation, that environmental impacts actually go down by fixing overfishing problems, and at the same time you get enhanced livelihoods and greater production of food. So it's the no-brainer part of meeting this global challenge of meat production. The unfortunate thing is that even if we fixed all the world's fisheries, we can only meet about 10% of that projected growth in animal demand. So the long-term solution needs to, obviously needs to include fixing fisheries, but it also needs to be thinking about how we incorporate sustainable aquaculture in a very big way, I think, as in terms of meeting these long-term demands. So last, let me focus on classes of solutions. And Larry's going to talk a lot about this for parts one, I say. But I think that there are 3 aspects from our work that really stand out. And one of the key things that comes out of having these kinds of quantitative estimates is that we can really not only identify where the problems are, but also where the successes have been, and think about how do you then try to replicate those successes at a rate that's faster than the problem is growing. And so that's kind of the message I want to get from these 3 points. So the first thing is these two comparisons show that there's a lot of value in information. That you take the exact same institutions, same countries, and the fisheries that are well studied and have a lot of information are in much better shape on average than the ones that have limited information. So we need to find ways of getting relevant information to assess the status of stocks so that whatever the form of institution it is in that particular place has a potential way of making informed decisions. The problem is this needs to work to really address this problem. It's got to work in small-scale fisheries in a whole variety of different settings around the world. So it can't be something that involves a lot of money or really well-developed institutions for a lot of different places that this is going to take place. So there are key challenges there. This is a place where science can play a really important role, and this is by developing a broader array of what we call data-poor stock assessments, which is taking very limited information and gleaning as much knowledge as we can, rather than trying to come up with the perfect estimate of what these stocks are. There are a whole variety of different approaches that people have been developing. One of the postdocs in our lab has come up with some really nice techniques that actually use marine protected areas, no fishing zones, as a reference site that allows you to very inexpensively estimate what the appropriate level of fishing mortality rate is outside of the no-take zone. So it creates economic value to fishermen by creating no-take zones, independent of what those no-take zones actually do to the biology. Another class of the solutions on this is we haven't really had much discussion in this meeting about about marine protected areas and no-take zones, but that has been one of the reactions to the repeated concerns about overfishing around the world, in the sense that people have set up marine protected areas of a variety of forms now in hundreds of locations around the world. I've been involved in that. I know a number of the speakers here have been involved in a number of these kinds of activities. And if you do a synthesis on this, these kinds of no fishing zones can have really dramatic conservation benefits, leading to pretty dramatic recovery on average in the most recent synthesis of 450% increase in biomass relative to areas outside, and comparable, reasonably large increases in a whole variety of other things. And even though most of these were really set up as a mechanism of insurance against overfishing, there are a lot of reasons why MPAs actually could be a beneficial tool in terms of fisheries. And the big reason is because the fish have no idea where the edge of the MPA is, and as a consequence, they occasionally swim outside, or their larvae get transported outside, and as a consequence, these banks of fish that are stored in the no-take zones can be benefiting areas outside. There's clear evidence in a number of places that this kind of spillover of adults can enhance total catches in the areas outside. On average, in this analysis of about 10 different studies, about a 200% increase in these different fisheries. And so if that's the case, why aren't fishermen clamoring for no-take zones? If they really can have these kinds of benefits, and if they have the other broad benefits that might come from better management and things like that, why aren't we just getting them really excited about this? And I think part of it is because it takes time. The average time for these responses was 7 years, so that the short-term effects of these MPAs is all costs. And so convincing people that doing something that is going to be good for them in the long term is part of the challenge here. But the other is because these things do not really fix the problem that creates this challenge outside. And I can just show that by a very simple cartoon, that even if you have this spillover of adults or larvae into the areas outside that presumably is benefiting the local fishermen, nothing precludes the boats from other areas or other fishermen from entering the fishery and reducing the likelihood that the people that paid the initial cost are the ones that actually get the benefits. So it doesn't in any way actually guarantee that individuals are going to see higher catch rates, because those catch rates can totally be compromised by an increase in effort if there's no restriction on access to the areas outside. So this is fundamentally just another problem of inserting no fishing zones into a situation where we've got this classic tragedy of the commons problem. Now, if you haven't seen this movie, I'm going to give you the 30-second version. If you don't know what the tragedy of the commons is, imagine two kids with a very cold smoothie, single smoothie and 2 straws. What's going to happen? They're going to suck like crazy to try to get more of that smoothie than the other little kid, right? And so you get a brain freeze. So if you substitute fish for the smoothie, fishermen for the little kids, and brain freeze for a collapsed fishery, you basically have the problem of the tragedy of the commons in these kinds of open access fisheries. That there's a short-term incentive for individuals to race to catch as much of that catch as they can, even if there is a limited total catch that's available. And this leads them to do a lot of stupid things that may seem like not to be in their own best interest, but in fact it's because we have created these kinds of incentives that actually drive this kind of behavior. Now, economists have argued for a long time that the solution to this problem is actually to put more rights into oceans. And the simple way you can think about this is just imagine how different those two kids would drink their smoothies if in fact you split it into two half the size. They would steward their smoothie in a completely different way, drinking it very slowly, enjoying it, getting lots of benefits. And they get the exact same amount, but their behavior is modified by the fact that they are no longer having to worry about sharing with the other individual. Okay, this is a broad kind of argument that's been behind the move internationally and within the U.S. into a class of solutions called catch shares, where basically you give security of ownership for some aspect of the catch to fishermen to shift their incentive from short-term race with other individuals to a long-term view of stewardship, and that their financial and the environmental incentives then align on longer-term stewardship. There's a lot of ways you can actually put rights into fisheries. You can do it in terms of share of the catch, which is individual quotas, which is the U.S. has done for a number of its individual fisheries around the country. You can also do shares of area, which are more analogous to the way we allocate rights on land, where it's effectively exclusive property rights for access to a resource in the particular ocean. These are commonly called turfs. And given the fact that many of the problems that I talked about once we did this detailed analysis are for small-scale fisheries, and with this broad, really highly diverse group of miscellaneous coastal fisheries, one of the most exciting solutions to this potential problem, I think, is in fact this notion of putting more spatial rights into fisheries management. The real kind of star of doing this has been the country of Chile, which put in place in the 1990s a system of turfs for a fishery for a small snail called a loco. That's a predatory snail. The fishery had collapsed, been closed for 5 years. They implemented a new right where a group of 40 or 50 fishermen got together, have exclusive rights to a particular area of the ocean for fishing. There are now over 700 of these that have been set up along the coast, and the results have been pretty dramatic. So if you compare now the density of these locos inside the turfs compared to outside, it's dramatically higher inside the turfs than it is to the areas that are still open access. And the areas inside turfs now are actually quite comparable to densities that we see within complete no fishing zones. Okay, now these are obviously bigger in the no fishing zone, but nonetheless the fishermen are managing these areas to have substantially higher biomass in these fisheries. And it leads to catch rates that are 10 times higher than they are in the areas outside. And the other striking thing that emerged out of this was a huge effect on biodiversity, that in addition to just focusing on the species that they were fishing, the fishermen really started to take ecosystem interactions into account. And they've seen these increases in biodiversity inside these turfs that are now at about half of the increase in biodiversity we see in complete no fishing zones. So although there are a lot of different ways of thinking about solutions to this problem, and Larry's going to talk extensively, I think, about a number of these approaches of putting more rights into local fishermen, particularly these small-scale fisheries, I think hold enormous progress, hold enormous opportunity for actually making some progress in this particular area. The last thing I just want to emphasize that I think the nature of these results, to me, suggests that we need to really be focusing on building better pipelines between academia and management institutions and NGOs that are effective at driving change. And I'm really excited about the nature of the proposal for the new initiative here at Northeastern, because it's really got this emphasis. Scientists need to be engaged in a way that both listens to what the scope of the problem is, but also makes us be more effective in terms of having a rapid pipeline between new solutions and their effective implementation in a variety of different settings. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the subsequent discussion. Yep.
Good job.
Oops, that's not the right slide.
He's messing with your presentation.